Good morning. Thank you for being with us this morning to our session on communications and around issues in crisis management. We are very fortunate this morning let me just say before I forget to do this, and that is that we're delighted that we're obviously assisted in this process of presenting these from the MASS facilities in Lexington by Alexa Lucy with the Sterling Technology Group in Winchester, who are tremendous resources. Without that, we could not do this. They're just fabulous, and they help us technically to do this. So we appreciate you on the webinar. But let me just say that our presenters today are obviously Chris Horan. Chris has handled many cases of crises that our members have dealt with over the course of the years. We at the association strongly recommend that you reach out to Chris when you run into a problem or an issue that needs some assistance. Chris is there to be a great support and help to all of us, and has done so in the case of many superintendents and school leaders. So we strongly advocate that you reach out to Chris. Also, let me add that we are fortunate again to have with us Peter Schaefer. Peter is the superintendent of schools in Abington and has gone through a number of issues that he will be discussing as we move forward through the webinar this morning. So as, again, we welcome you. We will go through until approximately somewhere close to 11 o'clock, maybe a little bit shy of that. And also, I would say that we welcome your questions, and you'll be hearing that again from the presenters, that you can type in and will show up on screen that they are able to answer if there's certain issues that we are not covering or they are not being covered. So with that, I want to turn the program over to who is starting off. We're going to start off with Chris. Chris?
Sure. So I'm just going to put your slides in front. Is that okay?
That'd be great.
You can just click next when you're ready.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
The window so we know if we're in the frame.
Oh, yeah. You want to see the window?
Oh.
So
Thank you. It's great to be joining you again here at MASS for another webinar on crisis management and communication. Happy to be joined by my colleague Peter Schaefer from Abington, as Paul said.
Good morning.
So we're going to take you through today to talk about various aspects of crisis communication. Specifically, our presentation is organized into sort of some practical steps you can take before, during, and after a crisis. So part of this is about sort of communication, and part of this is about sort of how to be strategic in avoiding and trying to keep yourself out of crisis to the extent possible in the first place. Can we just see a little bit more of the
Sorry
slide?
about that. I guess I just want to make sure we're in the
Yeah,
frame.
you're in the frame. You're in the frame. You look great.
Perfect. Great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. So as I said, in this webinar, we will recommend strategies to help superintendents and their teams prevent and manage a crisis, emergency, incident, or controversy in your school districts, and with a particular focus on effective communication before, during, and after the situation. Now, we're using this word crisis. We realize that takes many forms, and that you each may have joined the call sort of thinking about different types of crisis. I think when we hear that word, we sometimes think of those emergency situations that arise sort of out of the blue and can be often related to something that just appears in a sort of critical way. But we recognize that crisis also takes other forms that may be sort of more long-term, things that are perhaps more like sort of a bad budget season, where you have to make difficult decisions. And it's not a 1 or 2 day story, but a several week or several month story. Other controversies and scandals that may take place in the district. And we were talking a little bit this morning before the webinar began about sort of what is on the minds of superintendents. And we'd love to hear from you about the kinds of crises and controversies that are really front and center for you, or that you feel you want the most support in being able to prepare for.
One of the things we're going to talk about later, or I'd like to talk a little bit about later too, are those controversies about things that don't exist at all or whatsoever. There are trolls on social media that are pumping information that you have no idea where it came from. And so nothing factual, but it's something in the perception of the public, it becomes factual for them. So it's something we have to deal with.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's start with some of the steps that you might take before crisis strikes in order to make sure that you and your team and your district are as prepared as you can possibly be for what is often something that we cannot be prepared for, but just to think about having the infrastructure and sort of protocols in place. So the first thing, as we think particularly about the sort of crises that are sort of school-based, is to update your emergency management plan at both the school and district levels. And obviously, it's really critical that this happens in consultation with public safety experts. Neither Peter nor I is an expert in public safety. We're here today to talk primarily about communications, but we recognize that so much of this, particularly in this day and age, in a post 9/11 environment, a post Sandy Hook, Columbine, Parkland, other too many places to name, it's critical that you and your staff and your families know how to operate in a crisis.
And Paul was doing a good job of hitting me with some interview questions before we started the session. One of the questions reminded me that in Massachusetts, everybody knows every 3 years we're required to update that plan and get it approved. And as Chris said, that happens in conjunction with police and fire. It has to get approved by the school committee.
Great. So once you have those plans in place, it's critical, of course, to distribute the crisis plan to all staff and to provide training at least annually, including a review of communications protocols, and be sure that parents and students know what to expect too. It's not enough just to sort of have this plan in place and teach people once and hope that they remember it forever. People's memories are short. We saw, particularly those of us who were in schools after 9/11, I feel like everyone got in a really intense mode of being very well trained. And then with each passing year, I think we get a little bit more complacent. And sometimes these emergencies and crises in the news serve as a wake-up call. But sadly, we shouldn't have to wait for those. People need to be aware of the plan and ready to act on them no matter where we are in the world. Along those lines, you want to establish clear roles and responsibilities for crisis communication at the school and district level, including the school committee. We're going to talk later in the presentation specifically about sort of how to work with the press. And part of that is about understanding everyone's role and responsibility and who is and is not authorized to talk about the press. We'll get into more detail about that shortly. But there are other roles and responsibilities in making sure that everyone at the school district level knows who is responsible for what, and frankly, who is not responsible for certain things so people aren't stepping on one another's toes.
Dealing with a school committee can be difficult for all of us as superintendents, especially in these situations where school community members can feel an ownership to the community, that they want to be a voice. Something that I would ask people think about and recommend is that MASC has a great boilerplate policy on who speaks to people in a crisis and how that can unfold. It's nice to have that coming from them as a source rather than you as the superintendent. Sometimes it can be hard for you to ask your school committee members to step out of the light during those situations. That boilerplate policy does a nice job of delineating responsibilities for information from the school system.
Great. We touched on this one already, but determining who is and is not authorized to speak to the press during a crisis is important to do right now, not to try to sort that out when crisis strikes. Okay, so those are the sort of before tips, and we could talk more about those if folks have particular questions. But let's shift to the moment when crisis strikes and what are the steps you have to take at that point. So when crisis strikes, the first and most important thing to do before we act and start communicating with anyone is to sort of make sure we have the house in order. And the first step in that regard is to convene the right people and ask the right questions. Before we can go out and start commenting to families or staff or anything, it is disastrous to go out in a crisis and give misinformation or incomplete information if there's information available. So convening the right people and asking the right questions right away.
So I'm going to say this, I think, throughout the presentation. While you're doing this, continue to be mindful of your audience and your responsibilities. When you're planning these statements, don't plan them for the local newspaper or for the Good Morning America show. You plan them for your audience, for your parents, the community you serve, for your children. And so also, while planning these things, you have to anticipate what could happen next. So you have to bring those people together that can help you with that.
Great. So what we're going to do now is lay out sort of 5 suggested steps for when crisis strikes, and we're going to break out into each of those and provide a little bit more detail. Convening the right people, asking the right questions. Second is to craft your messages, and we're going to spend some time in a moment talking specifically about what that entails and how best to craft messages. We're going to then talk about sort of how, once you have your messages crafted, how do you communicate with your stakeholders in a variety of ways? And frankly, it's a variety of stakeholders in a variety of ways. How to work with the media. And then repeating steps 1 through 4. We know this is an ongoing iterative process. And just as you're taking each of these steps, you're also finding out how then to go back and convene additional people, ask additional questions, perhaps tweak your messages, go back and communicate again with your stakeholders, continue to work with the media. So again, this is not sort of a start to finish process so much as something that's rather circular. And it's all happening while the crisis is taking place. So while you're doing all these things, you are also, of course, trying to manage the crisis itself. So now let's look at each of these steps a little bit more deeply and explore how you can act effectively. The first step, as we say, is convening the right people and asking the right questions. So who, for example, are the right people? Well, certainly the district staff. You know that you're, depending on the nature of the emergency, you're going to bring together your safety folks, your facilities folks, if it's building related, personnel, if it's something to do with an employee. Certainly you've all had experiences with different sort of health matters, whether it's an H1N1 outbreak or other sort of flu situations in schools. And in some cases, perhaps academic folks, if there's a teaching and learning implication for these things. You also, of course, want to involve school-based staff for matters that involve particular schools or all of the schools, including administrators and teachers. And in many cases, it requires you going outside the district and talking to related agencies, whether state and or local, police, fire, EMS, public health, again, depending on the nature of the situation that you're dealing with. And in other cases, it requires outside expertise that is not from an agency, but perhaps legal advice, communications experts, others who can provide you particularly targeted strategies that are nuanced and specific to your crisis.
I think while you're convening these people and while you're asking them questions, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, it's also important to make sure you're aligning what you're saying with them. You want to align what you're saying with your chief of police, with your chief of the fire department, with the town manager, with the mayor, so that you're all on the same page.
That's a great point. So it's not just about convening these people once and then walking away and doing your own thing. It's about staying in communication with all of these different folks on an ongoing basis, making sure you're giving them the information that you have, getting from them the information that they have, and I guess Peter said staying on the same page. Sorry, so Matt just asked a great question. I should have said at the outset, yes, we will share this PowerPoint with you as a PDF at the end of the session, so you'll have all these slides at your disposal. Sorry we didn't mention that, so thanks for asking. So again, going on with convening the right people and asking the right questions. What are some of the questions that you might have to ask? Again, this is very specific to whatever matter you are dealing with, but the most important question, of course, is what do we know about the incident? Give me all the facts that are available about what we know about what has occurred. And of course, what don't we know is sort of the equivalent question. Does the situation still present any ongoing danger or risk? And obviously, if the answer to that question is yes, it takes you in a very different direction, because the most important thing, of course, is trying to get the situation in hand and eliminating any ongoing danger or risk. That's very different than if the answer is no, it's under control. That gives you a little bit, obviously, more time to be able to go and manage the situation. Another question is, what is the specific timeline of events? This is something parents and certainly the press are going to want to know. When did something begin to happen, and what was the timeline that occurred after that? What's the sequence, and how far apart did things happen? Particularly if things didn't go well, this is a question you're going to be asked. So you want to have a clear sort of record of everything that took place, when, where, why, and by whom.
I think an important thing to remember there, too, is when did you find out about it? So, for example, a danger stranger message, there was someone in town in a light colored, some type of vehicle that approached children, and you feel a sense of responsibility to tell the community that it occurred, and it happened 2 weeks ago. You need to be very clear. We became aware today that 2 weeks ago this occurred. Otherwise, people will wonder why you'll have to spin back why you didn't tell them sooner. So you have to be very clear in some of your messages about when you learned about something, because people will wonder why you waited to tell them.
That's a great point that Peter just made, and I want to sort of underscore that. And we'll probably touch on it at other times during the presentation. But I think, there is the crisis itself, and that is in itself a story about what happened. But oftentimes what becomes the larger story is exactly what Peter's talking about, and that is, how was the situation handled? And is the bigger story here the mismanagement of a situation or the concealing of a situation and finding out that you knew about something long before you disclosed it to parents or staff or the public? And sometimes that's when a story takes on a life of its own. So it's really important that you know, as Peter said, the timeline, but also are very transparent about what you knew when and when you chose to share that and why. So who has been involved? Who is affected by the incident? Have the correct policies and protocols been followed? So that goes to what we were just talking about. You want to be able to say, yes, X happened, but we're so proud of our staff and our students because they did exactly what they were instructed and trained to do according to policy and protocol. Is this an isolated incident, or could there be others? I think we've seen sometimes that an incident will happen in a particular school. I worked with a district once that had an incident involving a break-in overnight, and the school was vandalized. And what the district found was that the security measures they thought were in place to protect school buildings overnight, cameras, alarms, that sort of thing, were actually not in place at all. And in the course of this, they went and tried to repair those matters at that school, but what they didn't ask was the key question of, is this the case in our other 16 buildings? So the press, of course, immediately asked that, and parents in other schools asked that, and the district was caught somewhat flat-footed and had to then go back and say, oh, you're right. Not only is this school faulty in that regard, but several of our other schools have problems with their security cameras and alarms. You want to be the one asking that question. And so when something goes up in a building, you need to be asking, is this also true in my elementary schools, my middle schools, my high schools?
I'm going to go back to a statement I said earlier. I told you I'd revisit it. You have to remember who your audience is, and the second thing is you have to anticipate what could go wrong next in any situation. So you have a responsibility to those people to talk to them about your system, because that's your audience, and what could go wrong next. Well, the other buildings were also not covered. So in anticipating that, you can best prepare for fixing those other buildings and also how you're going to answer that.
Great, thank you. And then, of course, does the situation disrupt instruction, sports, or other activities? That's what people are going to ask, especially when it happens during the day, during the school day. An immediate question parents have, besides, of course, the safety of their kids, is, does this mean there's not going to be a lacrosse practice today, or the softball game, or glee club, whatever may happen after school? Was teaching and learning interrupted? Were there other activities that your partners need to know about that will or will not take place because of what happened during the school day?
A storm moves through, and we had a tornado warning in my section of the state the other day. And so obviously you think of your high school sports that are out on fields, but are your elementary schools out on playgrounds? So your message isn't just that we brought the kids in off of the football field, but we also brought our students off of playgrounds. Again, remembering your audience, your responsibilities, what could happen next, what else do I have to deal with?
Absolutely. And of course, what are the next steps? It's an important question too. You want to take stock of the incident as it's what has already occurred, what's happening now, but also you want to be prepared to say, here's what we're going to do from this point forward. Okay, let's move to the second step in all this, and that is crafting your messages. To me, this is the most critical step besides everything you need to do up front to be prepared in the first place, but about the words that you choose and the statements that you will make to your audiences, your parents, your staff, students, partners, the general public, the media. What is it that you are prepared to disclose publicly to all those different audiences, and how do you craft those messages effectively? So we're going to offer you some tips in that regard. First of all is to know the legal parameters of what you can and cannot say about a particular matter. When I talk to superintendents who are in crisis mode or anticipating a controversy coming down the pike that they know about, this is often the thing that I think trips us up the most. I'm not an attorney. Believe Peter's not. And I always say that up front, that I can't offer legal advice. But what I can do is encourage you to talk to your attorneys, particularly about tricky matters involving personnel or children that have legal implications, and making sure that your lawyers are pretty clear with you about what you can and cannot say within the confines of the law.
So later you'll see I've provided a couple of statements, holding statements, different statements to the media, samples of different things we've dealt with. We'll talk about that, I think, as we go.
Okay. Of course, in your messages, you want to summarize the key facts and events and to avoid excess detail. This is really important. You know, a good message does not necessarily mean that you've given everyone soup to nuts, the kitchen sink. I think sometimes the best decisions you can make are also figuring out what you can leave out. Not because you're withholding critical information, because it's extraneous and unnecessary. We talked in the previous slide about you wanting to take stock of every little detail that you can. And that is absolutely true. That doesn't mean you need to go and share every little detail with the public. Some of this is about synthesis, especially when you're trying to get information quickly to busy parents who may be working or doing who knows what on a busy day. You want to get them the information they need in a very synthesized way that they can digest.
The facts. I guess it was Joe Friday. I'm dating myself. He used to say, stick to the facts. Speaking of which, I think we're having a fax come in now.
It's a question. It's a long question.
So, for example, if you've got a member of your faculty or staff that's charged with a crime, you can use what the district attorney or what the paper has published, the district attorney has charged them with. Those are facts. You want to get that information out there as a school system. You want to check with your attorney. You have to be careful what you say, that you do not somehow hurt someone's reputation unfairly for an alleged crime. But if someone were charged with alleged crime and it's in the newspaper, it blows up at night, you can quote exactly what the district attorney has charged the person with, because that's a fact. Again, I would check these things with counsel, but it's just an example of how if you stick to the facts and you don't offer opinion or emotion to it at all, it will help you more safely get yourself through these things.
That's good advice, and I would add to the list of things that are not facts, speculation. You know, it's tempting when crisis hits to be able to sort of say what you think may have happened, but you're not sure, and that's a recipe for disaster. If there's a fire in the basement of a building, God forbid, and someone says, I think the boiler may have been the cause, don't say that to the public until you know that the boiler is the cause. You don't want to later find out that it was a stray cigarette and you've been out there with misinformation. Do not speculate. Only stick to the facts, as Peter said.
Facts like we're cooperating with the fire department and investigators to determine the cause. You want to get the message that you are right on top of this and working with those experts that will determine the cause. Remember your responsibilities. You are responsible for the safety and the well-being of children. You are not an arson investigator. So try to stay in your lane as a superintendent of schools and leave other speculations to those other experts.
Absolutely, and that's what that next bullet addresses. Mention any other agencies or parties involved. You want your audiences to know that you're not operating as a lone wolf here, that you are reaching out to people who are experts in their areas, including police, fire, whomever else is necessary. You want to describe what the school or district has done in response to the incident, including to referring to any relevant policies and protocols that were followed, letting people know that this didn't catch you by surprise, that you've had policies and protocols in place, and presumably you followed them. You want to address whether instruction or other activities are affected by whatever incident has taken place. And that's particularly important because I think sometimes when we hear about an incident in a school, we assume that sort of chaos has ensued and that the school day sort of fell apart. And if that's not the case, as is usually not the case, we want to make sure that parents and others hear, actually, this thing took place, but teaching and learning continued on schedule. Classes continued to be held. the school day was not disrupted, or it was disrupted in a very minimal way, so people know that you stuck to the matter at hand. Outline any next steps, as we talked about. Parents and others will want to know what happens in the aftermath of the crisis, and always provide a contact for questions and follow-up. And it's important that everyone is on the same page about who that contact is. There are going to be some occasions when it's appropriate to say, if you have further questions, please contact your school principal. The principal needs to know that and be ready for that and be on board. There are other cases where it may be more appropriate to provide a district contact person to be able to answer questions. But you certainly can't leave that out and just hope that people know who they're supposed to contact.
When an issue occurs at a building, 99% of the time we'll provide information that says that they should contact their building principal. Again, remembering your audience, that's who parents want to talk to. They want to talk to somebody at the building. And also, as the superintendent of schools, you are on top of this. You are getting the facts, but you are also a step away from it. And hopefully you have principals that you're working with that you can rely on to do that. You may need to coach your principals. You may need to spend some time with them talking through an issue. What if this is asked? What if that is asked? So that they don't put their foot in your mouth.
Great point. You always want to affirm student and staff safety as the top priority. And I think most superintendents I do that very well, and include in their messages some statement to that effect. And we just want to also mention that you should be mindful of both the content and tone of your messages. I think in the heat of the moment, we can be focused solely on content and make sure that we have all the facts right. But it's not enough just to sort of get the facts and spit them back out. Good writing, good message crafting is about thinking about tone also, and being very intentional about the tone you want to set appropriate to the incident at hand. So for example, anything that involves victims of any kind, where people are personally affected by an incident, particularly if students or staff are involved, the tone has to be not just one of strong leadership, but empathy and sympathy and compassion. Just being mindful of what the right tone is for a particular occasion.
And again, remembering your audience will help you with that. For example, parents want to know that the students are safe. You're on top of a situation. You're working with local agencies to address it. And then sometimes you're even able to thank those agencies for their support and their help, which is a nice piece of crafting a message about a crisis to the community. Thanking the agencies that you're working with also creates a sense of we're okay, we're so okay. I'm even going to thank the people for the good job that they did and the other message that they did a good job in this situation. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how to end these messages with something like the safety and security of our students and staff as our top priority. I hate to drive this so many times towards safety messages, but I think that's unfortunately what we deal with most of the time these days. The other thing I would like people to be mindful of is, hopefully, and most of the time, you're not the person that created the crisis. Mm-hmm. You're the person that is managing the crisis. And so you're sailing the ship through a storm. So just keep sailing that ship. And it's a very stressful time. But if you continue to tell yourself, again, I didn't create the crisis, I'm managing the crisis as best I can, and I'm communicating my management of that and how we're handling this to the people who care about it. And the more often and the more clearly you can do that, as Chris has said about the facts, that's the best opportunity to avoid. I think we all know what happens. The media trucks show up and they go from car to car outside your building, and they ask your parents or the community, did you know about this? How did you feel about this? What did you think about this? And they wait to get that one person who's so angry at the school department that they're just going to lay you out on television. The more you can get out facts in a calm tone, remembering your audience, the less opportunity there is for people to sit in the car and say, well, they didn't tell me anything and this place is falling apart.
Good advice. Paul asked me to remind you that if you have questions along the way, feel free to just type them right in your window there, and we will see them on our screen. So this can serve as sort of a checklist for you. Again, the huge variation here depending on the particulars of an incident, but at least this can help you sort of think through before you send that letter home or write that robocall script just run through this list in your mind and say, have I thought about each of these pieces, even if I don't need to incorporate every one of them.
That's another piece that we can get to, or maybe mention here. I'm very careful with the robocalls because they're good and they should be used, but you really have to make sure those are even shorter and repeat things, because what I have found is people will listen to them and then they're gone, and they're not like a sheet of paper or an email or something that they can read. So they're used, but when you use them, you really have to get those down to about a 30-second message that you repeat, because people don't hear it the right way, and then their fears and their imaginations can actually work against you.
That's a really good point. And we are going to talk in greater detail shortly about some of those tactics in terms of what you need for each of those different modes. But I think Peter raises an important note, and that is that because the robocall has to be so brief, and you probably can't say as much in that as you might in a letter, it's often a good idea to end your robocall directing people to the website. And you can just say, for more information, go to abingtonps.com or whatever Abington's web address happens to be. And right on your homepage can be a link or the message itself that provides additional detail that you weren't able to put in that message. Okay, I need to say this in every training or webinar or session that I do. It seems obvious, but it's important to state that the focus of all messaging should always be students. If you have sent out any sort of message that doesn't refer to kids or students teaching and learning, the bottom line for what we are all about, we have missed the boat. So make sure that every message talks about students and what this means for them. Okay, another messaging tip that has been useful to us when I was working in Boston, we sort of adopted this approach, and that was to resist the term lockdown. It is an uphill battle, this tip, believe me, because I know the press goes to that term immediately. But I think the term lockdown creates an image for parents and others that is not representative of what I've understood to happen in schools during many of these situations. And people may picture what you see in the stock photo there to the right, where students and staff are, in such a panic that nothing effective is happening. And in fact, what's really happening in most cases is that, as I said, is that teaching and learning is continuing. The school day is going on as normal. Lockdown simply refers to the fact that no one can come or go from the building. And we started referring to that as safe mode. And we found that some press outlets adopted that and went with us on that. Others were resistant and just stuck with lockdown anyway. But at least in our own communications to families, we found that safe mode put people in a very different state of mind than lockdown that felt very terrifying.
We've been saying things like we've implemented our safety procedures.
Yeah.
I also think in some communities, lockdown may just be this ubiquitous term now because the press has used it so much, people are almost anticipating it. And I'm not sure in these days with so many different ALICE plans compared to lockdown that people are even using that. I mean, lockdown is obviously a part of ALICE. I found that a safer term is or a way to address this is we've implemented our safety procedures.
Great. Another question has come in that I don't know the answer to. Alexa, you may know. Tara asked, will the recording be available? Can people go back to your website and get the webinar?
Yeah, we can put it on YouTube.
Yes.
Alexa's answer was that the webinar itself will be on YouTube. Thank you for asking. Okay, so the third step in our little checklist here is to communicate with stakeholders in a variety of ways. So you've brought all the right people together, you've asked all the right questions, you have the information you need, you've crafted your messages based on some of the tips that we shared. Now, what do you do with those messages? What are all the different ways that you can communicate effectively with your stakeholders? So let's start with the who. With whom do we need to communicate about this situation? First is your school committee. Not necessarily literally first in the order of things, but 9 out of 10 times, if not more, that's going to be the first folks you want to reach out to, or at least making sure that someone on your team is reaching out to them. You as superintendents, these are your bosses, and you don't want them to hear about something because of a letter sent home or posted on Facebook or God forbid, in the news.
I've been fortunate that I've been able to work with the chair of the school committee over years. We've designated them as the person who calls the other members. So I will call the chair. I'm obviously most importantly managing a situation. The first opportunity I get, I'll call the chair, explain what's going on, and then the chair will call the other members. And if the other members have questions, they can certainly call in and ask questions. But that saves me 4 other phone calls.
That's great. Another who, of course, is other elected officials. And again, this may vary by community in terms of who is closest to the school district you need to talk to. But at some point, certainly to those of you who work with a mayor or a town or city council, those folks often feel like they need to be in the inner circle. And there may be protocols you want to put in place for at least acknowledging the situation to them. And again, this doesn't have to be you. You're probably going to be the one out there managing the crisis itself. But if you have an assistant or someone else on your team who can at least send a quick email to that set of elected officials when the time is right, it's a good political thing to do. Obviously, the school and district staff, we're going to talk about them, but making sure that your staff are the first to understand what's going on. We know of situations where in their eagerness to communicate with families, superintendents have forgotten to do the appropriate internal communication first. And then families have information that even administrators and teachers don't have, and they're coming to those folks with questions and again caught off guard.
One of the things we've done is when we craft a message for the community, we automatically send it to the faculty and staff, so they're hearing the same information. They know what the community knows, so that happens simultaneously.
Great.
Sometimes it has to happen before because you're dealing with a situation in the building, but minimally it happens simultaneously.
Absolutely. And of course, our primary audience is parents, and including them of students, of course. Most of what we're going to share with you is making sure that parents get the information they need in a timely way. So we'll certainly be talking about them a lot. Related agencies, again, there may be some that you have worked with leading up to this process, but there may be others who need to be communicated with at this point who may have not been as involved. I think this also pertains to partner organizations who may be coming and going from the schools. If something affects a particular school or all your schools, you want to make sure that the Boys and Girls Club and other folks who are involved in after-school programs know what's going on, whether they need to change their plans as a result.
Yeah, I think you also have to remember that we have a variety of ages, and we also have a variety of students with different needs. And we have to remember that we have parents who are concerned differently about children at a younger age or at an older age, or students with disabilities, and the way that their children are affected by things. And so oftentimes that requires a more personal touch, and you would have people in the special education department that might need to reach out specifically and talk to some of those families, depending on the situation in your buildings.
It's a great point, and you want to sort of think about all those different segments. How is a particular issue going to affect parents whose kids take the bus differently than parents who pick up or drop off their kids by car, or students who walk? Are there issues that are different for families who, for example, are immigrants? I mean, we noticed this in Boston and lots of communities when in the national political scene, there was lots of talk about sort of how immigrants might be affected by different policies. There's a different audience there for parents who are concerned about those issues and who may or may not be undocumented immigrants here in the States. You need to be mindful of the fact that there are two, if not more, audiences there. So those are the who, and again, we've talked about this, but being mindful of the order in which you communicate these things, because the order does matter, and you don't just want to sort of be quickly sending out messages to each of these audiences without thinking about the fact that as soon as one hears it, they're immediately going to go to their social media, and then someone who hasn't heard it yet is going to wonder why they heard it that way from someone else. So that's the who. Let's shift now to the how in communicating with stakeholders in a variety of ways. One bucket to begin with is just direct outreach. How do you reach your immediate audiences at the touch of a button? So, of course, we rely heavily now on these notification services, Messenger, Blackboard, Connected, all of those, with robocalls, that's phone calls. Again, these may be to landlines, to mobile phones. Different districts have different ways of managing those options for parents. Email is still a very valid way for a lot of people. And of course, text messages, very much. Some parents will want to opt into that form. Others would prefer other means. But I suspect in a true emergency crisis situation, text is going to be an increasingly powerful way of reaching people immediately. The beauty of these services is you can craft one message and get it out through all those different means, perhaps with a little tweaking, as we said, at the touch of a button.
So I know how it is in my community. I'm guessing it's the same in a lot of communities. We have parents that rely a lot on Facebook. It seems as though the parents are using Facebook, younger users of technology are using Twitter, but Facebook has a real presence in the lives of our families and the community that I serve. And a suggestion that my school committee gave to me, it wasn't my idea, and it was a good idea, was to have a district Facebook page. I'm sure many of you have district Facebook pages. What we'll do is we'll send an email out, a constant contact message, and it automatically feeds to our Facebook page. And what we've been able to do through the technology department is people can still communicate and post to the Facebook page, but it can't be seen. And so it's, for all intents and purposes, it's been shut down. So it doesn't become a two-way conversation stream and one more thing for you to manage in a crisis. It's just a way for people to get information. It's been extremely helpful because of how connected people are to Facebook. Every town has a Facebook page where people complain about or rail about services in the town from one thing or another. Sometimes it's the school department. This gets your message about what's going on out on that community forum that we all have to deal with. And again, our emails go out directly on our Facebook page, which ultimately ends up on that town forum, which is a Facebook page. So at least when people are speculating about things that maybe didn't even occur, one parent or another will ultimately be able to set the record straight because of our presence in the Facebook world.
Great, thank you, sir. Just checking on a technical issue here. Can we also get back to the question screen just in case something pops up? Thank you. So other direct outreach tools, particularly for reaching families and staff. Just a quick note about notification services. Because we are so reliant on these now, it's really important that those means of contacting folks, their contact information remains current and up to date. And I know every district struggles with that, making sure that when parents do move or change a phone number or email address, that the school and the district has that. I encourage you to be vigilant about that throughout the school year, so that when a crisis strikes, you do have the most current information available. So certainly at the start of the year, making sure you're collecting as much information from those different means of reaching parents is available. But also every parent night, every parent-teacher meeting, have a way of people filling out a quick card that says, I've moved, here's my new address, here's my new email address, here's my new cell phone number. Constantly giving people access to that, having a stack of those at the front desk in your main office, just so people are constantly reminded that you need to update that information in your systems.
So I don't know how many of you use, most people using Aspen or different data management systems. Everybody has something. And when we do the basic information sheets each year, we ask our parents, obviously, to fill in their email addresses. So what we'll do one time a year is we'll send out a message from our district-wide bank of data asking people to sign up for us to push information to them. That way we're respectful of how they want to get information. And if they don't want to sign up for these services, they don't have to. We see a spike and a jump in that every year. The other reason it's healthy to do that every year is if you're using these constant contact systems like we are to push information, when families move from one school to another school and they're no longer getting the emails from the school where their child attends. They're getting the email from the previous school, and they don't clean up their files. So those one time a year, in the beginning of the year, messages that say, this is the one time we're going to ask you this because we respect your privacy. Go to this link and either update or sign up for messages if you choose from the school system. That's been helpful to us.
Great. So certainly, as reliant as we are on technology, there are still some old-fashioned methods that are important to keep alive, and one of those is the quote-unquote backpack letters sent home. We certainly can't assume that every parent is on Facebook or Twitter, certainly checking emails or even using a smartphone. So sometimes the backpack letter, particularly for more detailed information, still serves a purpose. Obviously, that gets trickier as students get older, but particularly at the elementary level, I believe that parents still take that backpack on the kitchen table and unpack it every night. And if there's something important in there, a letter from you or a principal, it's more likely to get read. Some matters may require face-to-face conversations with your school communities, particularly things that go on for longer periods of time. So a good old-fashioned meeting doesn't hurt, particularly if there are lots of questions from the community that can't easily be answered through technology or in writing. Bring people into a room. Bring your staff and parents, and in some cases students, together and have a meeting and a conversation about what's going on.
I'd say that you can get so distracted by the number of people asking questions, and they all deserve answers because they're the families you serve. But to try to return the number of phone calls while trying to manage the situation, you can't do two things at once. So if you have these sessions where you bring people in, sometimes even before school or after school, and then you have the people in the room with you, the police chief, the fire chief, whomever, to answer questions together, can be very helpful.
Great, and just important to note, of course, that our families speak many different languages. You all know which languages are most dominant in your communities. So being mindful of translation for all of the things we just talked about and having folks quickly at hand who can translate into your major languages. Many of the notification services, if not all, have the option for families to select their home language. You can tailor your messages, both the robocalls and the written materials, into those home languages. So take advantage of that so that folks whose first language is not English are not left out of the loop. So another bucket of ways to communicate are these blanket outreach that are not targeted to individuals, but rather sort of broadcast messages that folks can tap into. We talked about them briefly a little bit, but certainly the website I still think of as being a hub of information. I don't think most parents wake up every morning and say, oh, I think I'll just go see what's going on in the Chelmsford Public Schools today. But if something does take place in Chelmsford, they may actually go to that website to find out the information, especially if they can't get it somewhere else. So particularly these important things. Again, if you've crafted a really strong message, one of the first places it should go is right on the homepage of your website so people can find it easily and quickly. We've talked about social media a little bit. Peter mentioned a couple of strategies. We're going to talk more about that in a second. But again, this is another place people are going to go in the course of a crisis or emergency. But also, even if they don't know what's going on, they're going to be checking their Facebook page while they're waiting online at the bank or sitting on the bus, wherever they may be. It's a great way to reach parents, particularly because we're not reliant on their contact info being up to date. They're going to get it in their feed.
And can I just say, when you're dealing with these different feeds, Twitter or Facebook, there are ways that you can automatically connect your email systems to them. So when you're sending out an email, you're not having to craft a whole other message or a whole other process. There's a way you can set these accounts up that they automatically will go out when you click a button simultaneously through Facebook and through Twitter. And the message is out there. You don't want to miss a portion of your population that is the Twitter population or the Facebook population.
It's a great point. I think consistency really matters. So crafting that one message really well, having it in a centralized place, the website ideally, and then as Peter said, all these different tools can all point to that same place where you use the same language, in many cases in an automated way, to have it reappear so that someone isn't reading one thing on Twitter and something a little bit different on Facebook, creating confusion.
And I think it's important to be able to shut off that comments feed where people can comment back on your Facebook page. I'm sorry, I'm not the technology person that can explain how to do that to you for you, but it can happen. I can give you more information on it if you want to contact me in Abington.
And the third bucket we're going to talk about in a second is, of course, media engagement. So we think about these sort of three buckets of ways of communicating: directly with families, through some of these blanket outreach strategies, and of course the media, whether we like it or not, is both an important tool for you to get information out, but also to hear back from folks about how the issue is playing out in the community. And again, we're going to go deeper on media in a second.
So this is an example of something managing social media. There wasn't even a crisis. All was good in the land. And on Facebook, we had a one-to-one laptop initiative where we distributed laptops to all of the students grades 7 through 12. And on social media, there became this this stream of questions, or this suspicion, or this imagination, to be quite honest with you, that somehow the school system was able to monitor what the students were doing through the cameras and the laptop. And people were concerned about that. And then there were other questions that were occurring on social media. So what we did was we created this Q&A, and we published the Q&A, and it went out through a constant contact email. It simultaneously went out with a link to Facebook and Twitter, and it put everybody to rest, and made people feel much better that we weren't using the cameras and the laptops to view anything. Not that anybody would have any interest in that anyway. And we can't, don't want it. And so this is just an example of there are things that aren't even true that become a media problem. And you can't stay ahead of it, but you can react appropriately. And a strategy like this helped. We did something. Believe it or not, we did something similar over the use of our fields. The youth groups in the community were frustrated by the use of building use forms and fields and fees, and it became a situation where we published a Q&A based on the conversations that were taking place on social media. And I need to thank my school committee for suggesting this, and it wasn't my idea, and it seems to be working well.
That's great. A couple of reactions. One, I really want to underscore something Peter said at the start of the slide, and that is that a lot of what we're sharing with you, I think, isn't even specific to crisis or controversy or bad situations necessarily. A lot of these tips, I think, could be used for sharing information with the community about any number of things. Positive, a new policy, a new program, an initiative, some important news you want to share. This same roadmap would serve you well. Another point, I think, is just, we could spend the entire 2 hours talking just about social media. It has made all of our lives perhaps more enriched, less enriched, but certainly more complicated. And a lot of what we hear from superintendents and others in education is just the challenges that Facebook and Twitter and other platforms present for district leaders. But we also hear about some of the advantages too, and I think Peter alluded to a few of them. The fact of the matter is, Facebook is here. It's not going away anytime soon. And we would be foolish just to say, oh, I'm not in that business, I'm staying away from it. Use social media effectively, not just as a way of communicating out, but as about getting a sense of what's on people's mind. And I don't mean that to mean that you need to react to every little thing that people post, because there's a lot of noise out there. But Facebook can serve as a sort of bellwether about whether something has escalated, and whether it is just something that one particularly passionate parent is obsessing over, or whether lots and lots of people are getting on board saying, yeah, I had that same set of questions about this laptop initiative, or what happened at that school today. So rather than just resist it altogether, think about using it strategically as both a communicating tool, but also as a listening tool.
As one of the pieces of information available to people, I had a letter that was written by the chief of police and myself. Is that one of the things that are available to people?
That was one of the PDFs.
Okay. Yeah. That's an example of, and it's something I'm sure we're all dealing with, are threats of violence. We have parents who, well, what happened to that student that made that threat? What happened? Are they going to be back in school? What's going to happen? And it's a natural. Their children are going to school with in your buildings, so parents are going to want to know that, and you obviously can't tell them personal, private information about another student that made a threat to the school population. So, in the materials that went out, what we did in Abington, there's a letter that was written by the chief of police and we wrote it together. Again, parallel message, just the facts, and what we described was what happens when somebody makes a threat, and it talks about generally the procedures that are in place, not specific to any individual, in terms of the mental health assessments and work that are done, the searching of homes, sometimes for weapons, the checking of access to weapons through FID cards and things like that. And so it went out in a general way, written by the chief of police and I. Now, God forbid, obviously, any of us ever have to deal with one of these that is legitimate. We take them all seriously, and we put these probably similar steps in place in most of our districts to ensure that those things don't happen. There's no harm in telling people what those steps and those procedures are, especially when people are collecting information from the national media about the way other states handle things with weapons. And we know in Massachusetts we are the strictest state in the nation. And so people can find some assurances in the things that we're doing in a general sense.
Just another point about social media that's important to say is to make sure that you never share information solely on social media. There are sunshine laws that require us to make information available to everyone in this business. Therefore, because platforms like Twitter and Facebook require people to log in, that can't be the only place you publish something. So if there's something you want to put on Facebook, you also need to put it on your website, for example, and ideally through the other means we talked about. But just remember that you can't get away with something on social media alone, because not everyone can get into that without a login.
I'm a big fan of, I know how busy everybody is, just the same message goes out through all platforms.
Yep.
That way, you know, everybody got it, and anybody that didn't get it, it's not your fault. Even sometimes the letter home in a backpack. It's a way to cover yourself that every single person, even if it says letter to parents and it comes in a sealed envelope, or you have to take the time to do that. I'm a fan of just sending it out as many ways as possible with the same message.
Great. So the document that you see on the screen here is just a portion of a document that you also should have received. We sent you PDFs of a few sample templates that Peter wanted to share with his colleagues. And I'm going to refer to some of the others later in the presentation. Looks like folks lost audio for a second, but it's back on, so I guess we're good to go. Let's talk about everyone's favorite topic when it comes to crises, and that is working with our dear friends in the press through an incident and a crisis. Now, I recognize this can be one of the more frustrating pieces of the puzzle, but it's important to say that the press continues to play an important role. And while it may seem like a nuisance to have to deal with reporters and editors and producers in the middle of a crisis, we have to remember that this is in many ways the public's window into a crisis, or anything that's taking place in a school district. So we can't write them off. We could have a larger conversation about national politics, but we won't in terms of the press. But we want to spend some time giving you particular strategies and things to think about to make your interactions with the press as productive and useful for you and for them as possible. So the first thing I always need to say when we do these things is that there's a phrase I never, ever want you to utter. You could probably guess what that is, and that is no comment. Now, we know that you can't always comment, and as Peter alluded to earlier, in terms of there are some very confidential situations. We need to protect the privacy of staff and students, even those who are accused and those who may be victims of something. Their privacy is paramount. So I'm not saying that we need to disclose everything. Just simply uttering those two words to a reporter or anyone else, no comment, immediately implies some level of guilt or obfuscation at best.
However, it's always fair for the press to ask you any question. That's their job. They're doing their job. And as frustrating as that can be for you, and stressful as that can be, because as superintendents, we're in these roles because we put our heart and our soul into these districts, and so we take it personally because it's who we are. And so you can't. And you have to understand that it's fair for them to ask any question. And the advice I would give you, and it's hard for me to follow this sometimes, is try to stick to your script. Remember your audience. Remember when that camera is in front of you and the microphone, you're only speaking to your parents, because those are the people that you are responsible to. It's easier said than done, but if you try to be mindful of that, it will be very helpful. And you can often redirect those questions, because they can ask you anything they want. You can often redirect them back to your statement. Bill Belichick is the master of this. He's going to talk about one thing, and that's all he's going to talk about. And that's the advice that I would give with dealing with the press. But then also, I think that the press and people respect when, rather than saying no comment, you can say, as a result of my respecting the privacy of a child or a family or a personnel issue. This is currently under investigation with the police department. I cannot provide any additional information. People certainly respect that. I think they actually respect that more than someone who would say no comment or offer information that they shouldn't offer. So those are tools you can use under the advice of counsel. I'm afraid I cannot disclose any more information. Those are canned statements, but you should have those canned statements in your pocket because the press is going to ask you questions that you can't imagine, and that's their job, and they are very good at it. And so have those canned statements ready for those questions that you can't answer. It's in these situations you're not going to get in trouble for things you don't say. So stick to those facts. Try to stick to your statements, and remember your audience.
And I think along those lines, speaking of tools, the secret weapon you have in these situations when you really can't say much of anything is a written statement. So I think that when we think about the press, we often think that we have to either get on the phone with a reporter, do live interviews with a camera. And in fact, there are many times when you have so little that you can say that you don't want to do either of those things because you're just going to get peppered with questions that you frankly can't answer. So the other thing I never want to see in the press is the superintendent's office could not be reached for comment, or we reached out to the superintendent's office and they declined comment. That to me is the equivalent to some extent of quote unquote no comment. What the written statement enables you to do is put some very tight parameters on that and reach out to the entire press corps, print, broadcast, digital, at once with the kind of short, tight statement that Peter is talking about. So whether it's as simple as we can't share any information at this time in order to protect the confidentiality and privacy of students and staff, or one or two facts that you are certain about that you can share, but nothing more. Having that written statement goes out, gives you that cover. And the press, most of the time, will run it verbatim in lieu of having to say, the superintendent's office had nothing to tell us.
Because they can't, because you told them, you gave them that written statement. They can say you were not willing to comment on camera. They can say, and it's the truth, but you've given them a statement. And I can't agree more with Chris. When they Google you for the rest of your life, you don't want to be your face tied to what could be an employee who has behaved terribly, unimaginably. Again, you didn't cause this crisis. You're managing the crisis. And your responsibility is to get the information to your parents. So if you give the press the information that you gave to your parents, you've done your job.
Just a final note on this slide, and that is that the broadcast equivalent of no comment is also, there are times when the press is literally going to show up at your door with video cameras rolling. You walking right by them, or God forbid, putting your hand over the lens, Sean Penn style, is the equivalent of this. And that's not helpful either. So as hard as it is, you never want to be seen as that person with the equivalent of putting your jacket over your face or anything else that shows that you are hiding. You may have to actually stop and give that 10-second statement that they will run on the evening news, even if it's to say, I can't get into great detail at this time for whatever set of reasons that are appropriate to the situation, but not just walking by, because that footage will also appear of you streaming by and avoiding the press.
So the other thing I keep harping on, and I apologize for it, is being prepared for what could happen next. That could happen next. So having those prepared statements, as you leave your building, because somebody, your secretary called in and said, "Hey, Peter, the vans are out there."
Mm-hmm.
You need to be ready with statements in advance, and also be ready that oftentimes you get interviewed, and they say, "Thank you very much," and they go, "Oh, I'm sorry, I just have one more question," and that's where the zinger comes. That's the most difficult question you're going to have to answer. So it's sort of a way you let your guard down, and then they ask you that difficult question. Have those canned, ready responses available, and be mindful of them prior to walking into that.
Great. So what are some of the decisions that you need to make as a school district about media engagement? Again, some of these are before and during the crisis itself. Who? We alluded to this at the start of the session, and that is who are the appropriate spokesperson or spokespersons for a particular topic. In my mind, it's great when it's actually essential when the superintendent and his or her school committee can come to an agreement about what this is going to look like. In a perfect world, the only spokesperson for a district on things that are operational in nature should be the superintendent. Certainly things like an emergency situation, personnel matters, the other things that come up in that realm are not appropriate for a school committee to be commenting on. And having the school committee comment on them from an official standpoint can create confusion about who is in fact the CEO of your district. Now, there are other occasions when it is within the realm of the school committee for that limited set of things for which they are accountable. The budget, your own tenure as superintendent, your hiring and evaluation, for example. Policy matters. And in those situations, when it is something that are within the realm of the school committee, again, we want you as the superintendent and the school committee to be on the same page about who is speaking. Even within the school committee itself, it may not necessarily be that everyone has the freedom to talk to the press. Again, they literally have that freedom, but you may have to come to some agreement about the role of the chair, for example, and whether or not he or she may serve as the spokesperson for the school committee on official matters.
So everybody has the right to free speech. That's a good thing, including your school committee members. They are also citizens and parents in your community. I need to help support here what Chris has said and go back to something I said earlier. There's a great policy that MASC has that means that you as the superintendent don't have to go to your school committee and say, could you guys not talk to the press? You can take this policy from MASC that outlines roles and responsibilities prior to an event occurring, and you can ask your committee to consider it. It's from their professional organization making the suggestion, so it doesn't come from you. And it's a nice way to get everybody on the same page without you having to have it makes a difficult conversation easier for you.
Absolutely. I think the other who decision here has to do with when is it appropriate for the superintendent to be the spokesperson and when might the school principal be the person to go on camera or on the record. And again, I think there's some nuance to that decision. You may make a blanket decision about that in your district that applies to all schools, or it may be tailored to a situation where the principal may be busy managing the situation and you can take something off his or her plate by dealing with the press, or vice versa. Although similarly, some of your principals may be more adept at this than others. And you may say, you know what, if something happens to the middle school, I'm pretty confident that Sally's the right person to get on TV and reassure parents about what's going on. If something happens at the elementary school, Frank doesn't really have those skills as much. Let me take that off his plate and not make him the face and voice of the situation.
Couldn't agree more. It depends. In my mind, it depends on the situation. Building by building, situation by situation. Later, there's a form that we've included in the packet that I use that creates a place for those questions to come at the building level, and then they'll come to me. And what we do when there's something in the wind, even though they've already been distributed, even though we've already distributed these forms that you'll see in the packet, I redistribute them to remind people about the process as the phones ring and as the emails come in about how this is going to work.
Great. Now, how about the how of working with the press? Again, we talked about some of these earlier, but there's not just one way of engaging the press. There are different tools at your disposal, and you want to think about the options that you have and the different ways of engaging the press based on the situation, your own comfort level, and the context of a particular matter. So one way that can be useful is to hold a news conference. Again, this is not something that's necessarily going to be ideal for all situations, but if you do have the press knocking on your door from the newspapers and the radio stations and the TV stations, and rather than do 17 different interviews that consume your whole day, sometimes it is efficient to hold a news conference, particularly if it's not one of those kind of matters we talked about earlier, where you really can't say a lot. These are ideal situations when there is going to be some back and forth, and the press is going to have questions that you can answer. Just getting them all in one room at once and getting it out of the way is an effective news conference. more on that.
Just I can't agree more. And I think if you're in a situation where you feel the need to hold a press conference, or you end up in one, we all could at any given day. I'm sorry in advance, but they are sometimes the best way to handle things. We've done it where you make a pot, you give them a time, you make a pot of coffee, provide bottles of water, you get it all over with all at once. And then sometimes what is a good strategy, I think, is to invite the police chief with you, the fire chief with you, or when their press conference is, so that you can do it at different times. And when you're doing this, I can't stress enough, though, just stay in your lane. You are not the chief of police. You are not the fire chief. You are not the health person who's got the medical background around mosquito-borne illnesses in a crisis that could happen, a health hazard. You're the superintendent of schools. You're responsible for the children, their safety, and their education. So when you get these questions, when you're at a press conference, just stay in your lane. And if you've communicated effectively with those other agencies, you'll be able to say, you'll have to ask the chief of police. You'll have to ask the chief of the fire department. Don't become an expert in other fields. Just stay in your lane.
Good advice. I love those press conferences when there's more than one person at the podium with different expertise, rather than having the press run around to the police chief's news conference and then yours 10 minutes later from the schools, and then the mayor wants to hold one. Get together, show that you are a team, all on the same page, and each of you can address your different areas of expertise. Another tip for news conferences is that they don't get to go on for as long as the press wants them to go on. They get to go on for as long as you want them to go on. So if you've made your statement, you may choose to take questions or not. Presumably you're going to if you've convened the news conference. That doesn't mean they get 3 hours of questions. If at some point you feel like you need to wrap it up, you're going to say, thank you all for coming. It's great to have you here. If you have further questions, feel free to contact my office or not. But then you get to walk away from the podium. Don't feel like you are stuck there for as long as they want you there. You may have a person on staff who can play that role for you. Not necessarily communications director. I realize those are a rarity, but someone who can suddenly appear at the podium and say just that. Thank you all for your time. The superintendent has to get to a school. Appreciate your being here. Have a good day. Another strategy for reaching the press that works, again, depending on the situation, is individual interviews. It's not as efficient, especially if you have to do them back to back, work for everyone's schedule, but you may have different relationships with the media in your town. And you may want to sit down with the reporter from the weekly newspaper and have a different conversation than you might have with Channel 7 News, who you don't know at all. So again, individual interviews are an option. You can also sort of pick and choose in some cases. It's a slippery slope. I don't want you to sort of favor one outlet over another, because those other outlets will feel slighted, and that may come back to haunt you. But just know that you have that option. We also talked earlier about the written statement. And again, this is a really effective tool. You can't use it in every situation where you will seem like you are hiding, but use it strategically and effectively when there's very little to say, but you want to make sure you can say something on the record. Another set of questions to think about when working with the media is when. When is the right time to reach out to the media relative to the other outreach strategies that we've outlined? And again, keep in mind, once you go into the media, it is open season. So it's often not one of the first steps I would recommend taking. Get those letters out, those emails out, those text messages out to your families, your staff, certainly your school committee, and other VIPs who need to hear first. The people who you don't want to call, you don't want to get a call from saying, why did I hear about this on NECA instead of hearing about it from you?
You really need your community informed prior to the camera vans showing up to your town. Again, the strategy is to go from car window to car window and ask your school community what they think about the situation. And when parents don't know what's happened, it's frustrating for them. You can certainly understand, and that does not play well at all. It shows mismanagement rather than management of a situation.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about when you do agree to a media interview, whether it's one-on-one or in the form of a news conference. How do you take charge of this? I think part of the reason that folks are intimidated by media interviews, for very good reasons, are they feel like they're not in charge, that the person with the microphone and the camera is the one driving the bus, And all we can do is hope that we pass what feels like a test. Do I answer the questions correctly? Am I providing the right information? Did I see that question coming? And I encourage you to sort of have a little paradigm shift where you think of yourself as being in charge of a media interview. Even though you're not the one asking the questions, you are the one with the information. And you can share what you need to share and want to share, and be very artful about not getting into things that you can't discuss or frankly don't have the information to answer. So we want to share with you some tips for how you might take charge of media interviews. The first and most important is just to be prepared and to approach every interview with several key points you want to make and make them, regardless of the questions you're asked. Now, a few things I want to break down from this bullet. First of all, several key points, not 19 key points. I don't know about you, but I can't keep that many things in my head. And certainly you're not going to get them all into an interview. So ideally, 1, 2, at most 3 key points that you want to make sure you get out there. Oops. Thank you. That you get out there in the course of your interview. I've heard people say, gee, I wanted to make that point about the budget, but the reporter didn't ask me that. No, this is not about whether or not you were asked something. This is about you making these statements regardless of what you're asked. Now, often that may mean that you start off the interview by saying those things. A reporter's going to say, thank you for your time, Superintendent. The first thing I want to ask you is blah, blah, blah. And you say, that's a great question. I'm going to answer that in a second. But first, let me lay out for you a few things that we need to know. Again, that's you taking charge. It doesn't mean that the first question out of their mouth is the first question you need to answer. You can put the brakes on and say, let me make these points. In your mind, you're thinking before I forget them or don't get a chance to say them. And then you're going to get into the questions. But again, this is not a standardized test where they're in charge of what gets asked and answered. You are able to drive this bus.
Remember, too, that a lot of times, I know you've heard the expression, people asking questions they already know the answer to. So again, sticking to the facts, remembering your audience, and trying to refer back to that written statement. I want to apologize to poor Chris because I've jumped all over the place, and I've already covered this a number of times in our presentation. That Belichick attitude that I want to stick to. This is what I want to talk about today, folks, and he sticks right to that. And they could ask him a question about anything else, and he sticks right to what he wants to talk about. I hate to compare us or what this is to what politicians do, but if you'll notice, they do it all the time. Someone will ask them a question, and they don't answer the question. They talk about what they want to talk about, almost sometimes like the question hasn't even been asked. And I think Chris's suggestion is a good suggestion. You can say, I want to answer that question, but these are the things you need to understand first. The thing that can happen, which isn't your fault, is the editor back at the TV station can play what they want. And they can string in front of and behind what you've said whatever they want. So they can frame the context of what you've said any way they want. And that's an advantage that they have and that they will use. And so even it reinforces even more stick to the script. I don't want to go too off of this script, but I can tell you about a situation we had where we had a case of impetigo in our district with one of our athletes. Before the report, there was a story on MSRA, Mercer, and how many deaths there are in the United States. Then they went to our district and they talked about impetigo and about how you're not sure about what something is until it's completely diagnosed. And then afterwards, they showed a map of the United States showing how everybody's the death rate in the country around MRSA. And so even though everything was factual in the middle, it made it appear in my community like we had this terrible outbreak. The press can frame things the way that they like, which is all the more reason you want to stick to that script and try to take charge of the interview as best you can. Remember your audience and stay within your areas of expertise.
Absolutely. Oops, can we go back to the... Thanks. Along those lines, the points that you want to make, repeat them in the course of the interview. Again, if there's a question that's asked and it's an opportunity for you to repeat those key points, go for it. I've talked about being able to state those points right up front at the start of the interview. Same thing at the end. The conversation may have gone 10 different directions. you can steer the reporter and his or her editors and producers back to the key points by saying them at the end. Before we wrap up, I just want to say again, we know this is what we know. Here are the facts. It's okay to repeat yourself. Really important. Remain calm and professional. Don't get defensive. Easy for me to say, I know, but it's essential that no matter how wired you may be, no matter how intense the situation, no matter how frazzled you and your team may be in the heat of the moment, it's important that we don't let reporters get the best of us. And I hate to say it, there are some reporters who are very skilled at this, and they are trying to find your Achilles heel and to get you fired up and get you to crack. And you can't give them that victory, because that's exactly what they're going to want to put on the news, is that moment of you losing your cool or storming out of the room. You just can't let it happen. You've got to be cool, calm, and professional under all circumstances.
So you put your heart and your soul into your job, and you feel like you own everything, and you do. But remember, you get up to do right and good in the world, and you didn't cause the crisis. You're managing the crisis for people as best you can. So if you just continue to focus on that and speak with sincerity and not frustration, people will see that genuineness in the work that you do, and so it's okay to be sincere and speak from the heart about what you're doing. Again, within your capacities, not taking on the responsibilities of others. They're difficult conversations.
Great. And just what Peter just said, being mindful of not just the words you're using, but the tone of your voice, the tone of your sort of presence in the interview. And that includes your body language. The way that you sit or stand says more to people than actually the words coming out of your mouth. And we know that from research. So be mindful of that as you're being interviewed. Don't feel obligated to answer everything on the spot. Again, this is not a standardized test. If someone asks you a question, please don't guess. If someone says, how many of your 35 buses were late today? Don't say, I think it's 10, maybe 12, 15, I'm not sure. Say, that's a great question. Let me get that number for you and get back to you. Or if it's something that you don't know and you're not going to be able to get the answer to, say that too. Say, that's just not something we know at this time. If we get that information, I'll be sure to share it with you and our families. And then finally, we've mentioned this already, but wrapping up the interview on your terms. Don't feel like the reporter or editor gets to decide when that interview is over. You do. And at some point, you can say, appreciate your being here, appreciate the call, whatever it is. I've got to wrap this up. I've got to get to a school. Okay. When appropriate, I really need to say this. Own it. I think that there is a tendency in this day and age among so many of our public officials, elected or otherwise, to pass the buck and to play the blame game of, oh, that's not me, that's the city council's fault, or that's not me, that's the state, and vice versa. When appropriate, I think it is critical for superintendents to demonstrate leadership by owning an issue. Now, again, as Peter has said a couple of times, that doesn't mean you caused this thing, whatever this thing may be. But there's a way of saying, this happened on my watch. I'm in charge of this district, and it happened. I'm not talking about a fire in the basement, but some personnel matter, a budgetary indiscretion, whatever it may be, to say, I've got this. I'm going to find out what's going on. I'm going to take the appropriate action. You can rely on me to do the right thing in the situation. That's what I mean by owning it, and not simply getting defensive and letting someone else try to take the blame. I think the public is incredibly frustrated with that at the local, state, and national level. And if you can break out of the pack by being that person who says, I've got this, you really can distinguish yourself.
And I think it's also appropriate you can describe, you can say, this is a terrible situation. This is very concerning. This was regrettable. You can be human when you own responsibility with that sincerity.
Absolutely. Okay, so we mentioned some tools that we sent you earlier this week, and Peter's going to walk you through some of those.
So this is a crisis log we use. Oftentimes the phones at the schools will start ringing with the press calling. And so this is just a sheet we use at those phones. It's a fairly low-tech system. It's a piece of paper, which is a grid, that provides the time the media called, the date, the name of the organization, their deadline for reporting that you want to be mindful of. You don't want to aggravate the press because you're not going to have time to get back to them all the time right away. But you want to try to get to them before their deadline, because in the absence of you giving them information, they're going to pump out information. And you need to be a part of the story at your school system in terms of explaining what's happened, the name of the person who's called. And then I put this other column, this next column in, what information are they seeking? That gives me time to think about some of the questions that they might be asking. And then follow up, that's a note for me, is follow up required or not?
Great.
These are, earlier in the presentation, I talked about anticipating what could happen next. I think something that happens in the media is they like a story that can roll out over several days or weeks. And what can happen sometimes is new information becomes available. So as we talked about earlier, it's good to get the facts out. Get all the facts out that you can all at once, because you want to get this over with as soon as possible. You want them to move on to the next story. And hopefully it's a nice one, but generally it isn't. So get your information out all in one statement. Make sure it's factual. Hopefully things will move along and nothing else comes of it. But be prepared that the next day, let's say you had an employee who's accused of something terrible. Well, they're going to be arrested, then they're going to be charged, then there's going to be a court proceeding, then there's going to be a verdict of one type or another. So these things can roll out over time, and you need to be prepared. And what this is this is a sheet of the imagined horrible things that can happen, and just so that you're ahead of the situation. That's why these are why I call them holding statements, so that you're prepared. And then these types of holding statements should be done for any situation that could be prolonged and spend days or weeks in the public eye.
Great advice. Okay, we've got a couple more slides. We want to sort of fly through those and make sure we have time for your questions. It's approaching 10:30, so we want to make sure. I know we've got some questions from Paul as well that we will get to. So we've talked about before a crisis, during a crisis. It's important to remain deeply involved and vigilant after crisis strikes as well. So we want to share some tips in that regard. One, of course, is just to deal with the aftermath of whatever the crisis may be. You want to tend to those who are most affected by a situation. In some cases in schools, that may mean making counseling available. You know, we were talking earlier about sometimes needing to provide counseling in schools for things that didn't even happen in your district, with big things in the news that parents, staff, and particularly younger students may be concerned about and need some help getting through. When that happens, you want to be able to make those services available, but also let people know that they're available.
It comes to mind, Paul Andrews was asking a very good question before we started about with all of these tragedies that have occurred at schools on the national scene, what lessons have we learned? And because this is a seminar on crisis communications, one of the things that I've learned is that our organization, MASS, has done a nice job of giving us and sharing some of the things that we've all been doing in terms of communications that we've sent to our families. So the how to talk to children about tragedy. Media is pumping out these images of kids running from their school buildings with their hands over their head all night long. And that effect that has on our school communities emotionally is taken its toll. And it's been helpful in my community to send out counselors available to talk to help talk to kids. You know, call us if you or your family is in need of someone to talk to them. We've provided those clips of how to talk to your children about tragedy. And in terms of the social emotional learning piece, we all know that these incidents that occur across our country can trigger post-traumatic stress in people that have had similar experiences or related experiences, and it brings them emotionally right back to those moments. And so being a school community that publishes those things after something like this happens is what we've been doing, and the community has found it very helpful. They've expressed appreciation for it.
Great. Another action item after crisis strikes is to take any steps to prevent such incidents in the future, such as changes in policy or practice. Let's face it, sometimes we screw up. We're only human and we're doing the best that we can. But what we can't get away with is screwing up once and having that same matter happen again. So let's make sure we are learning lessons from everything, whether it's a safety incident or any kind of incident, and improve as a school district by saying, okay, that happened at the Hemingway School. Here's what we're going to do to make sure it doesn't happen at the Hemingway again or at any other school. So we want to take those changes in policy or practice and share them with the community. Another step is to update all stakeholders on those actions taken and other developments, including any resolution. I think sometimes when a story goes away, we just want it to go away and not revive it, and that may be fine in some situations. But I think it's also effective at times to be able to bring a story back up to show people what you've done. So the matter that I referred to earlier about the district that had a problem with break-in at a building where there was vandalism, within a matter of weeks, they had changed all their locks, replaced the security alarms, installed new video cameras. And when that happened, they actually went back to the press and said, we want to make sure you know we did all these things. Now, they had to remind people that the vandalism had occurred, but I think it was worth it in order to be able to take credit for showing improvement and taking those actions. And the press also feels like they're getting credit for exposing a story that resulted in change. And then the last point, it relates to what I just said, but determining whether or not to re-engage the public and the press if and when the matter is resolved. Okay. So throughout the crisis, no matter what it may be, Peter alluded to this very well earlier, in your words and your actions, we really want you to demonstrate a number of things. Leadership. First and foremost, in times of crisis, we as human beings are looking for leaders. We're looking for people to say, I've got this under control. I understand what's happening. You are in good hands. And most importantly, your children are in good hands. It's important that you demonstrate skill and knowledge. Again, this is where the teaching and learning piece comes in. Because at the end of the day, your most important job is the educator in chief. So to be able to show with great certainty and confidence what this means for your community, but also for your schools and for teaching and learning. Empathy and compassion. So many of these crises affect people, as Peter just said, in different ways, adults and students alike. And for you to be able to be that voice of empathy and compassion, and not just a bureaucrat who is so, focused on solving the crisis that you're not thinking also as a human being and expressing that humanity that Peter referred to a moment ago. Transparency and honesty goes without saying, but I think when these stories take on a life of their own, is not from the crisis itself, but from any perception or reality of a cover-up or a distraction or something less than transparent or honest that you or someone on your team is guilty of. That's when it becomes a bigger issue of, we could have forgiven him or her for what happened. What we can't forgive is the way it was handled. And that leads to accountability for yourself and for others. Again, we all screw up. And I think there are times when we need to say to our stakeholders, look, I screwed up, or my principal screwed up, the school committee screwed up, whomever. Here's how we're going to hold ourselves accountable. And sometimes that means very high stakes. People sometimes lose their jobs. I recognize that. But there are other ways to hold ourselves accountable for decisions that we make and things that unfold.
I think that that's a great thing to remember too, because another thing, as a fellow superintendent, everybody looks to you all the time to have the answer and be right about everything all the time. And again, because you care so much, you want to be able to do that. You want to be able to be that skilled, but you're not Jesus. And you've got to be able to admit mistakes and failures. And you haven't really made a mistake until you've been disingenuous about it or lied about it or tried to twist it. Because usually you're not the person who, again, created the crisis. You are managing it. So you can say, we regret this has happened. We are sorry that this has happened. It's okay to verbalize those things. Those are human responses. That's what people expect. That's what they should expect from their leaders. But it's hard for us as superintendents to come to do that because it shows a weakness. It shows you're not on top of every single thing in a district of thousands of students and hundreds of employees.
Those are great points. And this occurs to me another example of something that's not necessarily crisis specific, but perhaps in the realm of bad news. I think sometimes when we have things to share with the community, we want only to put out the good news. And I believe that you score so many points by being forthcoming about the challenges you face and the things that aren't working so well. I've worked closely with a couple of superintendents who had to release MCAS results, for example, or accountability results from the state. And there's a tendency to say, oh, let's put in our press release that the 5th grade results in this particular test skyrocketed and that we did awesome in 10th grade English results, whatever it may be, and try not to acknowledge those other things. To me, that's kind of a fool's errand. All of your results are public. People are aware of them. So at the same time that you're touting the successes you've had, don't be afraid to say, you know what, we're really troubled by these 3rd grade reading scores. They stayed flat, or worst case, they went down. That's not okay. Again, that ownership piece, to be able to say, we know we can do better. I own this, and we're going to go back and work with our principals and our teachers and our parents and students to make sure that those scores go up next year. Own it, put it out there, and don't try to hide it under a barrel.
And I think you can also say that's the purpose of the testing, so
Yeah.
that you can do this work, so that we can figure out, and every year it's going to change because the groups of students' needs change, and that's our job. And if you say it and you describe it in those terms, that's owning it, that's taking responsibility for it, that's a reality, that's not spinning it, and then people can't come back and imagine that you don't know what the heck you're doing. It's a similar example of this is when we drive home at night. Someone cuts you off in traffic and you get angry and you can't believe it. I don't know how you guys feel about this, but when they look back and they go, "Oh, sorry,"
Yeah.
that level of frustration I have just lets the air out of the balloon. It relieves that stress and that tension. It's just an acknowledgement. Yep, we got this. Yep, we're worried about 3rd grade, and this is what we're going to do about it. Is a healthy thing for you to project.
It's great. I love that analogy. So we're providing our contact information, Peter and I, if you have any follow-up questions or need any assistance down the road. Paul's given us a number of questions that we want to get to, and of course we continue to welcome you to type in questions of your own. Paul put this one out to us that we want to share. I'll offer some reaction and see what Peter has to say. Paul said, what don't you do in a crisis? We've given you lots of to-dos, but what don't you do? I think the 2 things that come to mind for me, one I already mentioned, is not losing your cool. Easier said than done, perhaps, but really to be as composed as you can and to try to be the person in the room who is, as Peter said, sort of letting the air out of the bag when everyone's energy and emotions and adrenaline are running high, to try to stay level. The superintendents I've seen who are most effective in crisis do just that. They are unflappable. The other thing I think is important to say is don't act alone. Peter just said superintendents don't have all the answers. None of us does. So recognize that the more brains and minds and perspectives you can bring into the room, obviously within reason, the more effective you're going to be in your response. So reach out to other agencies. Reach out to people who are thinking the way parents would think, if that's not the mindset that you're in at the moment. Get as many of those voices in the room, and don't try to do this on your own.
That's Chris Stoll, I was going to say. Use people in your organization. So when I write these statements, they're reviewed by 4 or 5 other people in the organization because I'm, again, feeling like I own it. You know, you put your heart and your soul into this. So sometimes your message isn't what it should be for the broader community through no fault of your own. It's just your perspective. So ask people that you can trust in your office, in your administrative teams, people who are parents. Does this, who are working in your system, does this sound like it should, does this sound, does this answer the question people are going to have? How does this sound? Rely on other people to help you. Don't do it alone.
And along those lines, I think another resource that is always available to you, we got to put in a plug for our friends here at MASS. I mean, there aren't many things that Paul and Tom and Chris and others here haven't heard or perhaps been through, and they probably know someone who's been through something very similar. So particularly for the matters where you have the luxury of a little bit more lead time, don't hesitate to pick up the phone and reach these guys and ask how they can be helpful to you, because they have resources that absolutely, I suspect, will be invaluable to you.
And I'll say it because Chris won't. You can also call Chris.
Sure.
You can tell he's had quite a bit of experience, and not feeling alone and having someone like Chris help you also gives you some confidence when you're sort of sailing through the storm by yourself. So.
I'll put in a plug because they're on our screen too that you have our Twitter handles there. And I know Peter and I both use Twitter pretty regularly, so we'd love to connect with you on there too. Do you have other questions from Paul?
What methods do you implement to review the incidents that have taken place or debrief? Depending on the incident and the staff involved, reviewing what's occurred. And as Chris has said, that can be part of your messages, that you're doing these things to make sure it doesn't happen again.
I would agree.
How do we keep these types of emergency happenings in perspective? In that overdosing on it, but remaining sensitive and aware. The tragedies that have been occurring across our country, I don't know about your districts, but students say things that they shouldn't do, or you could have a student just publish simply a picture of a gun and with no threat, which, unfortunately, people have a fascination with guns and weapons. You obviously you follow your procedures and your protocols because God forbid you miss something, and you want to do the best you can at that. I don't know that you can do anything about overdosing on it because we're pulled in so many directions by society. We just have to try to keep up with it, and society's overdosing on these things, and we're here to help them through it. So we do that as best we can.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think I would just add, it sounds a little bit cliche, but to take care of yourselves and those around you. I mean, I think one of the most powerful things I've seen in terms of the real focus now on social emotional learning is not just about kids, but about adults too. And recognizing that if CNN or Fox News or whatever is constantly in your ears and on your eyes, you're going to be overwhelmed. And so find ways to take care of your own mental health and that of your team, and do whatever you can not to be consumed by a 24/7 news cycle that can be pretty disturbing, to say the least. Okay. There's a question on here that I just want to have clarified. Tara asked, are there any scripts that can be made available? Tara, can you give me an idea of what you mean by scripts? Is that for certain particular crises like Peter's holding statements, or something else that we can provide that might be useful?
I have a sort of a mental framework about how a lot of these letters are written, but they're not really scripts. I can give you, because they all have to be individually crafted. They're situational in nature. They're all dependent on the situation. I can, if you want to email me, I can share with you some of those. It's basically, remember as a parent, the first thing you want to know is are the kids safe? And so I will often start with the facts. Everybody's safe. We want to thank people for the way that they've responded, police, fire. We're working with different groups of people on finding a resolution or reviewing our process that we have in place, and then a way for people to contact us with questions, and then close it with the safety of our students and staff is our primary concern. And so those are rather canned, but they're all sincere, and that's the way most of these flow. So it's not really a script, but I think they're situational.
I think that's true. Maybe what we can do is Peter looks through his files. I certainly have letters and scripts and robocalls from just about everything imaginable from my Boston Public Schools days. Perhaps we can compile those and share them with the whole group. That way, I'm sure others will want them as well.
And if you want to send me an email, you do have my Twitter account there, but it's Peter Schaefer at abingtonps.org. That way I can it's more easy to send you anything I might have through an email format.
Great. I'm going to turn this back to Paul for a moment.
Thank you very much, Chris. Those of you tuning in may not be aware of the fact that Chris served in, as he just said, the Boston Public Schools, and so certainly what he knew and how he had to deal with the multi levels of issues in the city of Boston is incredible. And of course, Peter is dealing with these every day as superintendent. So Chris and Peter do a great job with this together. I can't help but just as I was listening to them, think of the things we all should draw from their comments, and that is just to think of the methods that and the way they think. The way they think and the way they articulated today is the way that you should be looking at the issues through your minds as you're going through it, knowing the situation locally. I remember the times have changed so that the crisis issues also have some similarities in what is done with these crisis issues. But we are facing some very interesting and very difficult times. And the other point that I think was so important was the point that Chris made about taking care of yourself. I think that the deaths of students, whether they're deaths of accidents or whatever the case may be, take an awful lot out of the superintendent going through this process. So it's very complex and very difficult. And finally, and last, being prepared. What I sensed from both Chris and from Peter, they obviously talk prepared. They're ready. They feel that if you're ready to go, even though the circumstances are different, that is so important. So again, to Chris and to Peter, I thank very much, and obviously to Alexa to make sure that this gets out to all of you. I can't thank her enough either. So my thanks, and have a good day.